By ear. If you want me to repeat anything, because it's a two-way traffic, some are coming over here. I find your accent a wee bit hard to get onto. If you find my accent a bit hard to get onto, just put a hand up and say it again, please, or what was that point? Now, my short talk today is basically around the Siege of Derry, but we're not going to look at just one event. The Siege of Derry just was not a stop and a start, or a start and a stop event. There was a background to it, and there was an aftermath to it that a lot of people don't know about, and it wasn't that pleasant to the defenders of Derry. And it didn't say much for some of those in charge of our government, the way that the people were treated afterwards. So I'll maybe enlighten you on a few points that you were unaware of. But we'll go through a general look at, but we'll go back to the plantation, and we'll go back even beyond the plantation, because obviously religion plays a very large part in this. I'm a Presbyterian, and obviously my roots must come back to Scotland. My name's Clements. Some people say that would be Lamont. We call them Lamont, maybe you call them Lamont here, and MacLamont could be a derivation of Clements. And around my area, there's a place called Ochel, which is an Orange Lodge, same name, and the Earl of Castlestuart pays for their banner whenever they need one. The Earl of Ochiltree came over from Scotland with his workers on his estate, and if you go, and I went down through the little village of Ochiltree, it's in there in Robbie Burns country, near New Cumnock, and I found the old graveyard at the bottom of the town, overgrown. It's just a drinker's den, but I found Clemence's in the graveyard, and I found other names, and we'll concentrate a little on names. You will see a few slides I put up of the border reivers of the Scots, and those names are the same names that I see every day in my town or up to my local cemetery. Same names, and if you go out to America, there's a chap called Billy Kennedy in Ulster, and he writes magnificent books about following the Scottish Trail through Ulster to America and going down the Shenandoah Valley into Tennessee, Virginia, same names. So obviously there is a connection. So we'll start and let's see what we make of it. Go ahead. Religion. Presbyterian, as I say, I would now be referred to as a Protestant. But back a few years, they didn't say just Protestant on one side and say Catholic on the other. It was Protestant, dissenter, and Catholic. I'm a dissenter. If you're a Quaker, you're a dissenter. If you're a Baptist, you're a dissenter. You're dissenting against the main sacraments of the Church, I would say the Church of Ireland. It would be the Anglican Church or the Episcopalian, whatever you want to call them in your part of the world. Now, there are certain times I'm not too favourable to the leaders of the Anglican Episcopalian Church, but not to the common member. My mother is a member of the Church of Ireland. You do not take them in bulk. There was a special, still is in our country. They're talking about the metropolitan elite in London, and that they're going to get their comeuppance in the election, and richly they deserve it. In those days, you had those who ruled the country, and there was a huge gap down to the common man. And those who ruled the country obviously did it in their own interest, and not always in the interest of the common people. So, Calvin, Presbyterian, that would be my background. So if I'm talking about dissenter or Presbyterian, he would be the man you would feed back to. Next one. John Knox. Bring it down to Scotland. 1560, Scotland was a Presbyterian country. So you could, the majority of people in Northern Ireland on the Protestant side, in inverted commas, are Presbyterians. When we get to the Siege of Derry, you will find that of the 13 apprentice boys, 9 of them were Presbyterian. But the ruling elite in the Derry Corporation were not. And there is a conflict. And you would think, oh, they were all friends together, fought together, side by side. Yes, they did. But there was still that divide, as you'll see. Right, there was Knox, on again. Now, where did we come from? I think our people were mainly more Argyll. these are the real hard men of Scottish society. You know all about the border reivers. These blokes, I'm scared to say it, something like the Taliban. They were fearsome warriors, and they were quite ruthless. And over the years, very few people could control them. The one that I know about is Armstrong's in our country, Kinmount Woolley and so on. I'm sure you boys have all heard about them. There's the next one, please, and you'll see what they were up to. Armed warriors riding these small, hardy horses. They terrorised the border, and you would have found them right along the present border, Scotland, England. That is their home. But it didn't stop them raiding themselves and raiding into the more peaceful farming community further west and further north. On again. Now, look at those names. I was in Carlisle Castle, and I picked up a little leaflet, and it said these are the names of the reivers. And I went down those names, and 95% of them I recognise as neighbours of mine. You may do the same. Obviously, you will find those names crop up time and time again. There's Armstrong, they were one of the leading clans. Right down, there's an odd one, Carnaby and so on, we wouldn't have. There's a few I wouldn't recognise, but nearly them all. There's not many Fenwicks around our part of the country. The rest are all there. I could take you to a Graham within 5 minutes. I could take you to a Graham in 2 minutes. No, I don't have a Christ and so on. On again, you see the next lot? Look again. Look again. Headingtons, I have Hendersons. I don't know many Headleys, but if you go down them, they're there. I think you'll agree with me. There's hardly a name there you do not recognise. And the third and final one, and the Johnson there was me mother's people from Dripperstown. So I'm in the Johnsons, and apparently they hated the Kennedys. So there's a Kennedy in the room, apologise for that. But Rutledge, as surely lives beside me, all down. And Shafter we don't have. Bobby Shafter, remember the old tune. Simpsons we have, young. There they all are, and as I say, follow them through from originally in Scotland to our place and then out to America. So there is that link. And the thing is that most of them would be Presbyterian, because Scotland became a Presbyterian country. When the Reivers were at their height, there was only the one religion, but gradually they converted, most of them, not all, to Presbyterianism. On again. Look at the infighting. You think they're sort of an amorphous group that were all friends or relations? No. Look, every time an arrow pointed in, they turned on each other. So they were warlike. They were warlike, and when the plantation came, James was very glad to see the back of them. Those he didn't sort of dispatch by hanging, some of them fled and came to Ulster, along with a large number of other hard-working farming people taken mainly by a lord of an estate. So if your name's there, you might recognise somebody who's maybe a neighbour of yours, and a few years back, or a lot of years back, you would have been at each other's throats. Again, this is where they came to. There are 9 counties in Ulster. Some people just think of Ulster 6 counties. There are 9 counties in Ulster, and the present 6 were not the 6 that were planted. You take Antrim and down, facing straight across the North Channel to Scotland. You can see Scotland up there from Portrush, Ballycastle direction. You can actually see it. So there was movement over the years, and there was no need to plant Antrim and Down. And there's areas there in Down, all around the Irish Peninsula and so on. At that time, there was no Catholics, not one. That whole area was mainly Presbyterian, almost entirely Presbyterian. And later on, 100 years after the Siege of Derry, those people, and mainly those 2 counties, rose in rebellion against the king's forces, against the crown. And they were defeated heavily. David gave us a tour of Antrim town. There was a battle in Antrim, Ballynahinch, Saintfield and so on. And the rebels, the men of 98, were Presbyterian almost to a man. And yet, if you look into Irish history, look over, the men of 98 are now being celebrated by the Republicans. It doesn't add up. There was a Republican rising, there was a Catholic rising down at Vinegar Hill and so on, Scullabo in the south. But they have now claimed the 98 rebellion as theirs. Nonsense, absolute nonsense. And it's mainly because the Presbyterians took such a hammering, their clergymen were hung, they were killed in great numbers, and they were cowed. And the Presbyterian ministers, if you asked them now about it, they would hardly admit that those were their people. Just as Covenanters, I see sometimes, if I go to buy a book on the Covenanters, they call them fanatics. Fanatics. Covenanters are fanatics. And who's doing that? That's the present people in the churches refer to people who fought and give their lives for your faith. They're now regarded as fanatics. So if you come across, you can see where there was also English came in fairly large numbers and in pockets. You see that we have gone over the border there into present-day Donegal, and when Northern Ireland was formed, those people in that region called the Lagan with two G's, not to be confused with the river at Belfast, very annoyed that they were chopped out of Northern Ireland. There was a Protestant enclave in around St Johnstone, Lifford and so on, and we visited St Johnstone town. Used to be a Protestant town. There's one Protestant left on the main street that had been forced out. And you find in Derry City, before the Troubles, in the first few years of the Troubles, anything from 14 to 15,000 people from the city side were forced out. Now that's not often remarked when you hear John Hume on, or about what's going on in Derry and Bloody Sunday. About 14,000 of our people were physically forced to leave the city side, ended up in the waterside or Limavady or wherever they wanted to go. Pockets all around. The white areas were mainly, that's the Sperrin Mountains behind me. I can see Slieve Galleon up behind me. And that was left to the Catholics. At the plantation, the land was parcelled out. And obviously it went to the undertakers, the English and the Scottish. And then what was left to the Irish. The Irish actually ended up with quite a sizable chunk because it wasn't across the board plantation. There were pockets left of native Irish who more or less accepted the rule of King James in return for getting land. And so that is the background to the siege of Derry. Coming up, you see where Derry is up there, top left, but we'll see that religious movement and where pockets were is important in why the siege took place and what happened during the siege. Push on, next one. This is the city of Derry with the walls. Now some people are offended if I say Derry. They prefer to say Londonderry. I don't mind. I'm as good a lawyer as anybody. I can say Londonderry because the Prentice Boys of Derry, to me, 50-50. If anybody wants to be offended, I don't care. I know what Derry is, and I know the whole story of Derry, and I call it Londonderry or call it Derry. And in fact, County Londonderry at that time was actually called County Coleraine. So, something to say. This is the original city. There are the walls. It's quite small. All you fellas who are apprentice boys, and you had to be initiated within the walls of Derry. So you've been there. It is not a big city. Now, it was built in 1613. A fellow called Donington out of Limavady, and the walls themselves, 24 feet high, 12 feet across, 4 main gates at that time, and they'll be listed in a minute, and they'll be mentioned as I go through. If I have time to finish, you find that the Prentice Boys closing the gates, Ferry Quay Gate. If you walk across where you start your parade on the Prentice Boys Day, and you walk across Craigavon Bridge, and you bear up to the right, you go through a gate before you get to the Diamond. Ferry Quay Gate. That was the gate the Prentice Boys closed in the face of the Earl of Antrim's Red Shanks. Then, if you go up to the square, up to the Diamond, you're turning left, heading for the cathedral. If you're going straight on, Bishopsgate. Bishopsgate was the gate where King James arrived in April of the following year, and was met by a cannonball, and off he went. The other two gates, Butcher's Gate, is where you go up round the Diamond and look down where the police are standing, because that's down towards the bog side. Butcher's Gate, where Rawson rounded up some of the people from the outlying areas and was going to hang them in front of the walls if the defenders did not surrender. And then if you go down to the Guildhall, the water of the River Foyle used to lap up almost to the Guildhall, and that is the Shipquay gate. The first two that I mentioned, they were drawbridge gates, Butcher and Shipquay. You had the portcullises coming down. There was 4 gates, 2 and 2. On again, I'll show you a few scenes of it. That's a very old one, and you see the names are all different. Anybody familiar with the town, you never heard of Silver Street and so on. That's the way the city was. Next one, and you can move on, see the dates at the bottom. That's the way it was at the time of the siege. The names have changed. And the thing about Derry City with walls, you think, it endured a siege of 105 days. So therefore, it was hard to take. It wasn't hard to take. Apparently, all military experts say that Londonderry was within range of artillery fire from the surrounding hills, and it was actually lower in some places than the attackers outside. Usually, if you want to defend a place, get up high, top of a hill. This one, right up at the top, where the cathedral is, was probably the highest point, and you can climb up the Apprentice Boys' Hall right up to the tower, and you have a great view. But those hills are surrounding you, and in normal circumstances, good military leaders would say, we can take this city. So something went wrong. It meant the forces that were attacking them were not as organised as they thought they were, or they thought it was a pushover. It was easy. And at that time of the siege, you found that Mountjoy's forces had been removed from the city by King James's order, by the Airlifter Connell. They had left. They had hoped that the Red Shanks, which was a Catholic regiment, would have come in and taken over. By the Apprentice Boys closing the gates, it didn't happen. So there was the city ready for James to attack in April, and hopefully, in his case, he thought, if I appeal to them as the monarch, as your ruling, your king, you'll have to give in. As I say, he was met with gunfire. But he did one thing which affected the entire siege. He said, anybody who wants to leave now can go. There were 30,000 people crammed in that small area. 10,000 left. Now, from his point of view, it might have been a humanitarian gesture. From the point of view of the siege, he actually prolonged the siege, and at the finish, he was defeated. Because how could they have fed 10,000 more hungry mouths when they were feeding? People were eating rats, people were eating dogs' heads, people were eating this and that, everything, fat, gristle, lard, anything. So, removing those 10,000 from the city was a false move on James's part. But again, he didn't know. You can't foretell the future. That city, in the time in between, the Apprentice Boys closing the gates and James arriving, things had happened, and one of those was the people in the surrounding area were starting to move to Derry. Why? Because they had long memories back to 1641. 1641 was the time, it started the Civil War in England, but in Ireland you had the massacres, the 1641 massacres in Ulster. And it was the fact that the Irish rose, you could say treacherously, because beside me you had Phelim O'Neill, you had Owen Roe O'Neill, and they were friendly with Lord Caulfield and so on, all friends, and then suddenly, bang, the next thing, the slaughter began, and you see them depicted on your orange banners, the drowning of the people at Portadown, the burning of the people inside churches, and they said that from Mid-Ulster, where I live, right down to near Newry, out of the coast, it was the ditches were full of corpses, men, women, and children. So when the word got round that the Earl of Antrim's forces were closing in on the city, they thought, here it goes again, here it goes again. A Comber letter had been circulated in the previous year, at the end of the year, and it said there's going to be another 1641 uprising. People were panicking, and then our friend Lundy stepped in, and he was up governor of Derry, and he sent out words like George Walker down at Dungannon, where I taught school, don't even try to defend the town. It was on a fort, on a hill, could have been defended. Leave it and come up to Derry. And word was going out to people like Walker, you're in a hopeless position, don't stand and fight, come towards Derry. So people were panicking and they were on the run. And remember, these people had spat in the face of the ruling monarch. A few years earlier, 1685, it was the last battle fought on English soil. And what was it? It was the Duke of Monmouth, an illegitimate son of the king, who rose in rebellion. And what happened to him? His people were slaughtered after the battle, mainly by a character called Kirk, Sir Percy Kirk. And he'll come into the story later at the end of the story. And what happened to the ones that survived? They went before the hanging judge, Judge Jeffreys, and they were hung. So these people were not taking a gamble, thinking, we'll be all right, we'll sit out the war, maybe James will go away. You lose, you die. So you're in that position. And some of the people, like the Protestant bishop, the Church of Ireland bishop, Ezekiel Hopkins, he thought, this is too dangerous, we will not close the gates. It was these young men, almost unruly men, rushed forward and closed the gates. It wasn't the ruling authorities closed the gates. Ezekiel Hopkins said, let the king's forces in, and do not, you're treason. You're treasonable if you rise up against the king. So nothing was just cut and dry between all defenders wanting to fight and other people. So there was different varieties and versions of people's views. And all the time, we talked about 10,000 people left the city. Nearly every night, 20 people, 40 people were sneaking out. Other people were coming in. And in fact, George Walker is given great praise for being the main man in the defence of Derry. I tend to look upon Adam Murray, who we'll come to later. Adam Murray, this was an almost untrained army that they had. They hadn't a proper army to come in and defend them. These fellas come in and gather-ups. Murray rounded up men and horses. That was their cavalry. Other ones, as we looked down, they were almost rank amateurs. And certain men were giving money to pay their working people, their workers on the farm, get a uniform on you, get something on you, come and fight. And they were up against a professional army of King James's redcoats and the French army. So it wasn't going to be easy. Well, there wouldn't be so many redcoats, but the French joined the Irish, and they were up against it. Press on. I think there was one more there. Well, we'll push on again. Now, Richard Talbot and James II. Talbot ruled from Dublin, and he was the king's representative in Dublin. A strong character. James was a pretty weak character. And this fellow had plans maybe that James didn't think of. James thought, I've been called to Ireland, or I go to Ireland and Tyrconnell, and we'll win the thing and clear this out, and we'll have an Irish victory, and I'll be back on the throne. Tyrconnell didn't actually think like that. He thought, well, we'll use James, and when we use him, we'll get rid of him, and we might even, I'll stick in the Duke of Berwick or somewhere, another illegitimate son of royalty, and he'll be a token figure for me. I'll rule Ireland. So Talbot had his own notions on what would happen after the siege was over. James found the tide was flowing against him in England. William was coming, and Dick John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, loyal to King James. Next thing, there was going to be a big battle up at Salisbury Plain near Stonehenge. Next thing, Churchill, I'll change. I'm not going to win. I'm going to go for William. James then had to come to Ireland to conceal, made his way north, and there he was, outside the gates. So James then had to go away, tail between his legs, and he left the siege in charge of Frenchmen and a few Irish. But the opposition outside was more or less defeated. The Protestant Presbyterian had very little to rely on outside the city of Derry. On again, better rattle on quickly. There's the closing of the gates. There are the names of the Prentice boys. You're all familiar with them. And remember, 9 of them were Presbyterians. And Murray actually got them to wear a white armband to identify themselves. On quickly. There's the Ferry Gate as you come up from the Gavin Ridge. Yes, right then. There's the gates I mentioned to you. And quickly on. There are the companies. That's the way the companies were divided. George Walker, what was he? Rawdon's regiment, so many companies, 15 companies, and later on, Walker wrote a book at the end of the siege, and I'm the hero #1. Only me, I won the thing, all credit. Whereas John Mackenzie, clergyman at Cookstown, who's buried near me, I think my grandfather was the last old man in the town who actually knew where he was buried, out in Derrylowan churchyard. He was the chaplain of his regiment, and when they questioned the book written by Walker, he said, I don't know anybody called Mackenzie. He's the chaplain of your own regiment. So you can see, and then Mackenzie wrote a book of his own slagging Walker, and that was an outcome that you didn't expect at the end. You can run your name down, the names of them, and at the end, those 8 were decimated by Kirk when he took over the city. He cut 8 down to 6, he cut 6 down to 4, and he more or less said to Adam Murray and his people, after all the fighting, winning at Pennyburn, winning at Windmill Hill, hand in your armaments, hand in your ponies, hand in your saddles, and get out of the city. So that was the treatment he got at the end of the siege. On again. Some of her, Baker died the month before the siege ended. A respected gentleman, did not survive the siege, and these clubs called after him. Mitchelburn, I'm in the Mitchelburn Club. Mitchelburn and Baker actually fought a duel. Imagine, they fought a duel, and yet when Baker knew he wasn't going to survive, he recommended Mitchelburn to be the governor in his place. So they made it up. And at the end of when the fighting was over, Mitchelburn went to London to the British Parliament and asked them for the £10,000 that was promised, and that other men had to get compensated for supplying horses and arms and so on. He was thrown in a debtor's prison. That was the treatment by the government in England to what we look upon as a siege hero. It was Mitchelburn that had the bloody flag, the crimson flag, flying. And he's remembered for that, he's remembered in the clubs and so on. He's buried out there, Glendermot, as you go over past the hospital. So that's the treatment he got. Push on. Ling House at Limavady, that was where my hero would be. That is Murray. And that's just out at Cloddy. And they tried to turn it into a museum, but they couldn't raise the funds and people weren't attending. And that drifted away. That was a memorial to the siege of Derry, and it's gone. Ling House, Lyng. Another shame that shouldn't have happened. Again, get a wee bit more, most if you know the siege anyway. There's views coming in. Culmore, where the boats were to come up, and Kirk landed with these boats, and he actually had an army out. He took them round to Loch Swilly. He prevaricated. He could have acted. He hung back because he had fought for King James, and he had fought later on, or before he had fought at Sedgemoor, and he was butcher. He was a butcher at Sedgemoor. He was a butcher at Tangiers, and when he arrived here, he wasn't going to kill himself to come to what he regarded as rebels. Hung back and hung back, and it was only later that when the French decided, well, if James is gone, the only way we're going to take this city is to starve it out. And Rossin decided that the siege would become a starvation siege, and it very nearly succeeded. At one stage, actually, Murray came in after being over by Claddymore, where they were taken away by Lundy. They were trying to throw up a defensive line to hold back the Jacobite army. And Lundy's more or less said, no, come back, fall back. And rather than holding him at that point at Claddymore, and when Murray came back to the city, Walker wasn't going to let him in. Walker would not open the gate, and a man called Morrison opened the ship gate and let him in. So one of these things you think, oh, what's going on here? What is going on here? But they got Murray in. He won a victory at Pennyburn, and they killed Momont, the French Poussignan. The French leaders were being taken out, and Richard Hamilton had to take over, an Irishman. The Duke of Berwick was injured. So he was successful. At Windmill Hill, Mitchelburn had a good victory. These other boys jumped. It was like trench warfare. The opposition decided they would dig trenches and move closer to the walls, and the defenders, Mitchelburn, fired the artillery almost almost parallel to the ground. Took the heads of these blokes, killed 400 of them. And Ramsay, the leader of the Irish force, was killed there too. Two big victories and any big encounters. But it was mainly an ongoing shelling at night, and the people going to the cathedral. The cathedral, Church of Erin, went for their service in the morning. Presbyterians went in the afternoon. Walker was the quartermaster, and some people said he wasn't sharing it out equally. Another dissension. Press on. Views of the siege. You see the sort of the safety in front of the cannons, and you can see there cannons at a distance here could fire easily over the walls into there. So the city was not as safe as you would have imagined with these walls. Yes, quickly. And there's another view. You've all seen views of the city of Derry, and the people struggled on, and as it rolled on, the relief did not come. More people were dying. You can imagine that. You see it all on television every night in Africa and so on. Infection spreads. This Ebola and so on. You're getting a disease from somebody else. Infection was spreading, and people at the finish, there was nearly 400 a night. The last few nights, there was about 400 dying. It ended up, of the 20,000 that were left, about 7,000 were dead at the end of the siege, and maybe another 2,000 or 3,000 died afterwards. Because once you went out of that city, what was for you? The land was desolate, laid bare. Again, just another one. There's the Jacobite gun battery. Again. And that's in columns. And you find that when I'll show you in a moment, when the siege was broken, yeah, I've got a quick, they fired the big cannon. The fellow who fired the cannon became a clergyman, and he went after the siege to America, and he set up a town, Londonderry, and when he was buried, and his successor, Matthew Clark, became a clergyman, their yard of honour were people of the siege. They'd all gone to America. They couldn't live any longer back in. On quickly. There's a nice photograph of the spire. See, the spire is now on. That's where they fired the cannon from once they broke the boom. But yeah, this was the ships coming up, Culmore, and the next one I think is Mountjoy. No, it's not. That's that famous painting out there. And Walker is there. You're looking down the river towards the Mountjoy coming up, breaking the boom, and Reverend Mackenzie's over there, just to the left of that old man with the white beard. Quickly. There's the Mountjoy breaking boom. On quickly. That's your coat of arms. You have them received around the hall. Yes. The two accounts, Walker praising himself. He went and got honours, degrees from Glasgow, Edinburgh, feted as a hero. Went to the Battle of the Boyne, was killed just beside Duke of Scomberg crossing the Boyne. Next one. That's the alternative version from John Mackenzie. Again. Now, there's very interesting. I'm glad you get time to see that. And this is your ruling classes. A kingdom containing a Protestant elite who had intermarried, established dynasties, stored up fortunes, built houses, colonised both the polite society and the political institutions of the capital, and defined themselves against the cultures of Catholicism and dissent. We have that at the present time. We have a ruling class, and they are above anybody else. From what I can see, that's my view on it. And quickly, might one or two more. Religious, and quickly this one. This is what happened to the people, the Presbyterians. After a test act came in, of the 38 ruling councillors in Londonderry, 24 were forced to give up their jobs because they didn't belong to the established church. Test act, government office holders or members, crown coverage to take communion of the established church. How to do that? Fines for failure to attend services in the established church. Presbyterian ministers fined £100 in those days for performing pastoral duties, non-recognition of ministers, marriages performed were invalid, your children were bastards. That's just as common and crude as you could. If you were a Presbyterian, your children were not legal. Refusal by landlords to allow meetings houses on their land, that happened in Cookstown, and they got on to the Killian estate. Dissenters barred from teaching in schools, I'm a goner, unable to bury their dead without funeral service of established churches, tithes paid to established churches. Very quickly, there you are. And because of that, 1718, people were flooding out towards America, and that's why the population, all those people's names that you saw earlier, the same people are now out in America, dispersed amongst the Ulster Scots or Scots Irish. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Boris. Thank you. We'll have a short comfort break for about 5-10 minutes. I think maybe the band will go on about probably 25 minutes. Thanks very much for your attention. Thank you, Boris.